but your own intelligence community has assessed that the Afghan government will likely collapse.
That is not true.
Can you please clarify what they have told you about whether that will happen or not?
That is not true. They did not reach that conclusion.
Not just did I tell them, but there was a bipartisan warning, okay? You look at the intelligence, you look at everything before us, it was clear that not only was the worst case scenario out there, it was the likeliest outcome that was going to happen. And we kept insisting, what is the plan if this happens? What is the plan? And they arrogantly and they smugly ignored it. They ignored everyone who was warning them because they're the experts, they know everything, and now we've seen the consequences. There are two things now to keep in mind. Number one is Joe Biden was elected promising competence, the return of normalcy, the return of expertise to foreign policy, and we see that they can't even execute on something like this and ignore the people who know something about it.
Where President Biden talks about that America is back, it looks like we're back. It looks like we're back to Barack Obama, America apologizing, American weakness, and our adversaries not fearing us and our friends not trusting us.
There's going to be no circumstance where you see people being lifted off the roof of an embassy. But the likelihood there's going to be the Taliban overrunning everything and owning the whole country is highly unlikely.
It has taken the Taliban just over a week to seize control of the country after a lightning sweep that ended in Kabul. The Taliban declared the war in Afghanistan was over on Monday after they took control of the presidential palace in the capital, Kabul.
The question was whether or not the idea that the Taliban would take over was premised on the notion that somehow the 300,000 troops we had trained and equipped was going to just collapse. They were going to give up. I don't think anybody anticipated that.
When I was decorated by the 82nd Airborne after the capture of Musakala, it was a huge privilege to be recognized by such an extraordinary unit in combat. To see their commander-in-chief call into question the courage of men I fought with, to claim that they ran. It's shameful.
Here's some real numbers, unlike the ones we've been hearing about. The number of American service members killed in Afghanistan through April 2nd, 2,448. U.S. contractors killed, 3,846. Afghan national military and police, 66,273. Anybody who says the Afghan army wouldn't fight is lying to himself and the American people, and of course to the people of Afghanistan.
The fact was that the reason it wasn't happening is the last president negotiated a year earlier that he'd be out by May 1st and that in return there'd be no attack on American forces.
Look, I think it's fair to say that both Trump and Biden wanted our troops out of Afghanistan. You know, Trump is the one that struck the deal with the Taliban. Joe Biden 100% could have reversed that, as he's reversed many policies Trump put into place when it comes to our southern border, when it comes to the Paris Accords, when it comes to the Iran nuclear deal. I could go on. He chose not to. Why? Because he also wanted every last man and woman out of Afghanistan. And no one's really being totally honest about that fact. I mean, Biden is sort of saying, yes, I wanted it, but he's kind of feigning surprise that the Taliban would take over so quickly. I never saw that coming. Well, bull. He did. He knew that the Taliban would take over, if not within 11 days, then certainly within probably 6 months. He knew. He didn't care. He wanted the troops out. He was solving a problem that in large measure, Dan, didn't exist. There were no protests in the streets here in America about getting those last troops out. We had between 2,500 and 3,500 troops there, way down from where it was mid-Trump's presidency, 15,000 or so. The American people weren't out there marching, saying, bring them home. First, it was Trump who was trying to fulfill a campaign promise, saying, I'll bring them home. And then it was Biden who has an ideological bias against this, against having troops abroad and against this war, and wanted them out of there. And not much of a thought was given to what position is that going to leave Americans in, the international community in. And so I think both wanted the troops out. What I don't believe, however, is that Trump would have handled the withdrawal anywhere near as poorly as Biden has. And I just don't think there's any chance, as he watched the Taliban marching city after city after city, not living up to the deal he struck with them, on their way to taking control without any sort of a grace period to let us out, would have sat back and done nothing.
We continued to pound the Taliban when they violated the agreement, right? When they moved on a checkpoint or moved in a place that they weren't permitted to. We used American power and made clear to the Taliban that there would be real consequences. What happened here, Maria, is you had a leader who was unprepared to do that. When the Taliban pushed on the Trump administration, we pushed back even harder and imposed real costs on them. When the Taliban pushed on the Biden administration, they withdrew to a commercial airport that in no way has the capacity to get our people out of there with the speed and alacrity that needs to happen to keep them safe. If Americans are harmed as they move to the airport, you're going to go and crush them. You're going to put real costs on them. This is the model that the Trump administration had adopted. And each time we did that, we got a tactical response from the Taliban that respected the United States of America because they understood that there were things that they would not be permitted to do. Most importantly, harming Americans. Remember this, Maria, from the time we began our peace and reconciliation effort, our conversations, from the time we signed that deal in February 2020, not a single American was attacked by the Taliban in a serious way, and there wasn't a single American killed. That wasn't because the document, or we were going to go to court to enforce this document. It was because we demonstrated American resolve and power. And when you don't do that, this is the kind of thing, this chaos that you're seeing today in Afghanistan is precisely what ensues when America fails to lead.
Yeah, look, the war in Afghanistan had to come to a conclusion. This couldn't go on forever, but it had to be done the right way, not this way. And what this way reveals is you can get away with things with this administration, and they're not going to take it seriously. They're not going to know what to do about it. And I look back at the Soleimani strike, and it was widely condemned. It was called murder and execution, all kinds of people attacking President Trump for doing it. I assure you, 100%, I know for a fact that it impacted the psychology of the Iranian regime. And it's exactly what a lot about foreign policy is all about, is what do your adversaries believe they can get away with? Not what you're saying, not what you're writing. What do they think you will do? And the Soleimani strike sent the message it was important to do. The guy was a smug guy that would walk around, fly around with impunity. He thought he was untouchable until he wasn't. And it had an impact. There's no fear of that happening under Joe Biden.
Your top military advisors warned against withdrawing on this timeline. They wanted you to keep about 2,500 troops.
No, they didn't. It was split. That wasn't true. That wasn't true.
They didn't tell you that they wanted troops to stay?
No, not in terms of whether we were going to get out in a time frame, all troops.
I think he lied to the American public because actually his military advisors had reached the conclusion that the Taliban would take over very quickly.
Yeah, and you're seeing in our papers here that blame game play out where the military commanders are leaking to the press that they did indeed advise him of that and that he overruled them, saying, it's time, I'm pulling the troops out. Now the White House gets planted in the papers saying, well, those assessments weren't of a high degree of confidence and therefore Joe Biden couldn't really trust them. Here's what else I read in the papers here, leaked by the White House. Their defense, Dan, is, well, we didn't think it was going to happen this fast. They knew the Taliban was going to take over. They knew that the Afghan army, 300,000 strong versus the Taliban, 75,000, could not withstand the fight without the American air support and the American intelligence that we'd been providing to make that army functional.
But we've all seen the pictures. We've seen those hundreds of people packed into a C-17. We've seen Afghans falling.
That was 4 days ago, 5 days ago.
I think Biden shamed himself in the interview with George Stephanopoulos when Stephanopoulos raised those horrific images of Afghanis literally falling from the sky as they clung to the foreign planes evacuating from Kabul. And rather than show any humanity or any thought for those people and what they were going through in that moment, Biden flicked his hand in the air and said, that was 4 days ago. I just thought I've never seen a response from a sitting US president that had less humanity than that moment.
He didn't care. He was thinking about himself because that image is an indelible stain on his presidency and he knows it. And by the way, it wasn't 4 or 5 days earlier when the question was asked. It was 2 days earlier. So once again, Biden can't keep track of time or count days or isn't intentionally just trying to make it sound longer in time so it's not quite as jarring. But it is jarring. It's the bookend to the other image that helped kick off this war in Afghanistan, people jumping from the World Trade Center so as not to be burned to death. They jumped from the World Trade Center and fell through the air to try to avoid the bombs essentially flown into those buildings by al-Qaeda with an assist from the Taliban. And those young men fell from that plane, fell through the air, trying to escape that same group, the Taliban, who would certainly have killed them when they found out that they were helping the Americans. And Biden's response is basically a shoulder shrug and to get angry that the question has even been asked of him. This is the same guy whose empathy, whose competence we're told we must respect, even if you don't like his policies. And as they're falling apart, he's saying to us, well, I'm all about human rights. Our foreign policy now is going to be human rights based. And you're already hearing reports of young girls in Afghanistan being raped by the Taliban. Then they're forced to marry their rapists under a principle within the Taliban's edicts. Then you've got women who are the doors are forced open. They're forced to feed dozens of Taliban. When they come back for the third night in a row and the woman no longer has food, she's beaten to death. Okay, so our human rights new policy is going to take care of women like that and girls like that through, quote, diplomacy, because he's just, I guess, going to appeal to the Taliban's better nature to stop doing that. We're supposed to believe it, Dan, because the Taliban had some media training and has put a couple of guys out in front of a couple of microphones to tell us to ignore the child rape, the child torture they've been doing for years, the abuse of women, and so on, because it's a new, more reasonable group. Sure.
For 20 years, Afghanistan has been a joint effort with our NATO allies. We went in together, and we're leaving together.
But the front page of the Daily Telegraph in the UK reads, Parliament holds the president in contempt, condemning the dishonor of Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan and of the troops he left behind to face the Taliban.
And now we're working together to bring our people and our Afghan partners to safety. In the past few days, I've also spoken directly with the British Prime Minister, Mr. Johnson.
And I think Theresa May is wondering why no one coordinated with Great Britain, why the British military commanders who have been over there helping weren't involved in any of the discussions or the planning or even apprised of the timing of the withdrawal. What kind of a thanks is that by Biden to the Brits? And at the end of the day, are left wondering how their citizens are getting out, how the people who helped all of our troops, the Afghans who helped us, are getting out, and not being involved in the coordination, to the point where Boris Johnson can't even get his phone call returned from the sitting U.S. president who's on vacation. For 36 hours, we blew off Boris Johnson because Joe Biden, who spoke to no world leaders for a day and a half, couldn't be bothered to return his phone call. I'd be mad too.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to follow up on something you said a moment ago. You said that there's no circumstances where American citizens cannot get to the airport. That doesn't really square with the images we're seeing around the airport with the reporting.
Pass through the checkpoints that the Taliban, control. They've led Americans through.
The president said he has no intelligence that Americans have been unable to get there. The question, obviously, does that square with reporting on the ground?
I mean, just totally not. I mean, the reaction was pretty much one of, I mean, it was breathtaking. No indication Americans can't get to the airport. I mean, last night on World News, we had American citizens who had exactly that experience. They tried to get to the airport. They had waived their American passports. The president talked about all they had to do was present their passports and they'd be allowed through. They were beaten by the Taliban with the rubber fan belt from a vehicle. Multiple examples of Americans and Afghans, SIV applicants, who have now tried repeatedly. There's one woman we're tracking. She's back at the airport tonight. This is her third night in the row. The gates haven't opened. The Taliban haven't let her through. It just seems the reality and the rhetoric are miles apart. I'm not quite sure what advice the president's receiving, but the truth on the ground is that these people who are in fear of their lives can't get through. The other great question from Stephanie Ramos was about the Afghan interpreter who'd worked with American forces that our Martha Raddatz had spoken to. And again, we're receiving intelligence from him, from other people on a regular basis that they're trapped at home, that the Taliban are going door to door. I have a dear friend, an Afghan colleague, a journalist, who I met this morning. He's had the Taliban come to his house twice. He's had to move around the city with his wife, his 4-month-old baby, his elderly parents, and he doesn't know what to do. Now, he has all the right paperwork, as do all these other people. They just can't get through those checkpoints, and that is the problem. You can open as many gates as you like, you can put as many troops on the ground, and what they're doing, the evacuation flights are miraculous. They are heroic, what's going on with the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. military, and they are in a very dangerous position because they are literally just yards away from the Taliban, who are not under strict command and control. But people just can't get through those checkpoints. There is no organization, there's just chaos.
The Taliban is reportedly carrying out a door-to-door manhunt for people on their wanted list. That's according to the head of a nonprofit giving intelligence to the UN. He told the BBC Thursday they have lists of individuals, and even within the very first hours of moving into Kabul, they began a search of former government employees, especially in intelligence services and the Special Forces units. He says it could severely undermine a number of Western intelligence networks. The State Department spokesman said he saw a similar report.
This remains very much a disaster, and one of the contributing factors here is when you listen to the president, he is saying things that simply do not comport with the reality that we are seeing with our own eyes, that you hear Ian Pannell describing, for instance, when he says that every American can get to that airport. There hasn't been an issue with that. That doesn't comport with the reality that you heard Ian describe. It also doesn't comport with the reality that the State Department has been issuing in guidance that we have seen from the State Department to Americans in Afghanistan, encouraging people to make the trip to the airport to be evacuated. But even in the State Department's guidance, this is a cable that went out just on Wednesday, the United States government cannot ensure safe passage to the Hamid Karzai International Airport. So the State Department is telling Americans that they cannot guarantee their safe passage to the airport. And you heard from the president today that we don't even know how many Americans are in Afghanistan right now. So how can the president say that there isn't an issue getting Americans safely to the airport? And then the other thing, David, when the president said there have been no question from our allies, that our allies have been united on this. That's not exactly correct either. I mean, we saw in the last few days the British defense minister literally in tears, breaking back tears, talking about how the West looks weak in all of this and the fear of terrorism going forward.
We did not go to Afghanistan to nation build. And it's the right and the responsibility of Afghan people alone to decide their future and how they want to run their country.
In some parts of the administration, nation building is still a dirty phrase, but the alternative to nation building is chaos. A chaos that churns out bloodthirsty warlords, drug traffickers, and terrorists. And we've seen it happen in Afghanistan before, and I am quite fearful it may happen again.
Top House Republicans reveal that the Taliban now have access to over $85 billion worth of U.S. military equipment in Afghanistan. The figures are based on the amount the U.S. provided to the Afghan forces while training and assisting them, and on what U.S. troops left behind.
That includes 75,000 vehicles, over 200 airplanes and helicopters, over 600,000 small arms and light weapons. The Taliban now has more Black Hawk helicopters than 85% of the countries in the world.
Congressman Jim Banks goes on to say that the Taliban don't have just weapons. They also have high-end American technologies like night vision goggles, body armor, and security devices.
Is that the Taliban now has biometric devices, which have the fingerprints, eye scans, and the biographical information of the Afghans who helped us over the last 20 years.
And Republicans learned from the briefing that the Biden administration has no plan to account for or recover the weapons. Banks says Republicans will fight for a plan to account for the weapons when they go through the National Defense Authorization Act markup next week. But he's not concerned just about the Taliban.
It's that we know that al-Qaeda and ISIS-K still exist and are growing in Afghanistan, and eventually they acquire these weapons.
Congressman Jake Ellzey dismisses the claim that the Taliban won't be able to fly the Black Hawk helicopters. He also points out it's not just terrorist groups that can potentially access these weapons.
We have enemies and adversaries throughout the world, such as China, Russia, and Iran, who are more than capable of either buying those and flying them again or outright stealing them. Keep in mind that China and Russia have aircraft that look remarkably similar to our Generation 5 F-22 and F-35, and there's a good reason for that. Either they copied them or they stole them outright.
House Republicans are calling on President Biden to extend the August 31st deadline and stay in Afghanistan until every American is safely evacuated. House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy says it's clear from the congressional briefing that it's impossible to bring every American home by that deadline. He also says the U.S. should not have to follow instructions from the Taliban on what to do.
Secretary Austin, how many U.S. taxpayer-funded military aircraft have been flown out of the country, and what are you doing to get those back? We've heard of Afghan pilots taking those planes to third countries.
Yeah, oh, go ahead. Jen, in terms of the aircraft that have been flown out that you mentioned earlier, I have received reports of a number of aircraft that were flown into Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. Exactly how many, I don't have firm numbers on. In terms of what we're doing about them currently, right now, Jen, we're focused on the airfield and getting people out safely. And so we're going to take that issue up at a later date. And we're going to continue to try to gain greater fidelity on the issue as well.